Looked like you might have a question. Did you?
I've got a lot of questions.
Okay, Mr. Gartrell, Contra Costa
Okay.
Water District.
Thank you very much, Chairman Eisenberg and members of the council. I'm going to step through just a couple of things related to conveyance, storage, levies, and operations related to this proposal. First, going through what we've learned from the BDCP studies and the reliability that it does or does not, as currently proposed, provide, the portfolio approach and how it makes sense for getting to reliability and reduces uncertainty. First, you step back to last July when the Governor and Secretary of the Interior announced the project. They pointed out something important at that time, which was that with their decision tree approach, supplies could go up, they could go down. It would depend on how fish does, and that pretty much sums up the level of reliability coming out of the plan now. But it is much more than that. The studies, as what was pointed out as the current close to the preferred alternative, what they called alternative 4, the 9,000 cubic feet per second, with operations that would increase supplies over the current levels by about 500,000 acre feet, would actually reduce dry year supplies as low as 1.5 million acre feet in a critically dry year, such as 1977, something you expect to have about twice in the past and in 100 years and more frequently in the future, to as much as a 10% increase with the water users proposal, so that instead of getting a 25% allocation, for example, in a dry year, you get all the way to 27%. The fact of the matter is the BDCP does not solve the dry year problem. It doesn't matter how big the pipe you have. If you haven't got water to put in it, you just don't get any water. And that's why it's called a drought. There is no water. As Jonas mentioned, 50% of the water supply on average comes from the South Delta with the BDCP proposal, but it's actually 75% in dry years. So you're still highly reliant on that, and having a levy program that makes those supplies viable in the future is going to be important in the South Delta. Now, I think we heard earlier that maybe it's not so likely we'll have a sudden catastrophic set of levee failures because of the peat soils. But nonetheless, if we do have that kind of failure, whether it's fast or slow, there's an impression that no matter what, you're going to have the delta fill up with salt water, and that's not true. If it occurs in a wet year, it either fills up with fresh water, like a 2011, because San Francisco Bay is full of fresh water, and you've got fresh water out to the Farallones. Or you can quickly wash it out. In fact, the BDCP did a study a couple of years ago that then they don't like to talk about very much, where they took back-to-back critically dry years, created a levee failure in that, and the channels freshened up in about 4 months. It might be longer than that. But the point is, it's been said, well, the 3,000 CFS won't get you all the water you want if the levees all fail. But the fact of the matter is, the 9,000 can only be used in the wet years because of the restrictions they put on when you can take water out of the Sacramento River. In the wet years, you don't need the 9,000. I mean, you do need the 9,000, but you're not going to have the problem after the levee failure. In the dry years, when you do need it, there's no water to put in it. And you've got to explain to me why a 2.2 to 3.3, depending on the size that you finally come up with, million acre feet plus storage, won't get you through this situation when you can get through it less than that, down to 1.5 million, on a probability of something that's going to occur in 1 to 10 years, for example. You're going to have critically dry years, on average about 1 out of 10 years and 1 out of 7 that will be less than 2.5 million acre feet. You can live on that, but you can't live on 3 million acre feet plus what you have in storage. It doesn't make sense there. So this can work. On the storage side, if you want to have dry year supplies, you've got to have more storage. It's simple, and you don't get that without that. You have to have a sufficient amount for your emergency storage. I'd much rather have my storage and my reservoir full in that situation and nearby than depending on anything else in that situation. Levee improvements, of course, will reduce the likelihood, it won't eliminate it, of levee failures, but it'll reduce the likelihood of them going out in a big seismic event. Storage and reduced use lessens the burden on the delta and puts the water in the export area where it can be used, but it also increases the size of the pie. The conveyance redistributes the pie whether you take it from the north or the south, but it's really not doing much for you when you really need the water. That gets into another point, too, is that if you look carefully at these studies, they're telling us that we're going to be pumping up as much as 9 million acre feet in wet years. And we've already seen what happened in 2011 when you had an opportunity to pump a heck of a lot more water than we did. We pumped something like 6.5 million in 2011. But they actually stopped pumping in the middle of that because they couldn't put the water anywhere. And that's not the first time that's happened. It happened in 95, it happened in 98. It would have happened in 1983 under those circumstances. When we get these big storms, they don't just rain or snow on the Sierra. It's all across the state. The ground gets saturated. You can't put more water in there. If you don't have some place to put the water, you can't take those big gulps. And just as a slight aside, we all know what a big gulp is. It's what Mayor Bloomberg wants to ban, and it consists of a really big cup and a little straw. It's storage is the thing that gives you the big gulp.
Not a bad analogy.
And in one day, in December, this last month, Shasta storage went up over 150,000 acre feet. That's where you take the big gulps. You take it in the on-stream storage. You don't take it with conveyance. It's just not feasible. Finally, just the portfolio approach can deal with the uncertainty and provides a feasible solution I believe can work for all. It deals with the need to continue South Delta diversions. It builds in flexibility. If you build it big and then you find out because of climate change that you can't use it, or you hit your 6-year drought and you find out what the studies are already telling you, that you're only going to be using about 3,000 CFS max for 6 years. You only need one of your tunnels is going to be sitting there idle. You still got a mortgage to pay. Right? You build it small and you need it bigger later, you can always put in that second tunnel. I think from my point of view, I'm absolutely certain that this proposal will not be found, if studied fairly and comprehensively, to be the best alternative. But I am certain that something very close to it will be. It might be 4,500 CFS with more storage. I think about that. You build one of your tunnels and then have triggers when you need it to build the other one, but you don't spend all your money, all of today's people money on something you might need 50 years from now. But there's another thing I think is probably true. If the state board goes through with increasing flows on the San Joaquin River, as they have proposed, and increases outflow and tributary flows, as a lot of people believe they will, this will be the alternative that you wish you had built. And I think it has the best shot at making a good business case for a project. And that concludes my remarks.
Mr.